Hey everybody, it's Pastor Rob with today's Bible Break message. And today this is a part 2. Yesterday we had part 1, understanding who our real enemy is. Today's message is called My Neighbor. And we're in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37 through verse 39. Now I just want to say, man, I'm so blessed. Everywhere the Lord has taken us, we've had such great neighbors. Where we lived in Ravenna and where my wife and I lived in Lima, and now where we live in Holland. Man, it's been a blessing that God has just put us in such a wonderful place and surrounded with just sweet people. Different people from us, sometimes different age groups, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different origins, but just sweet people. And God has blessed us with wonderful neighbors. But I want to talk to you today about my neighbor. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 22 in verse 37, Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now listen, when Jesus points out something is number one, we ought to pay real close attention. And number one in the Bible is we ought to love God. Let me tell you something, friend. As a pastor and as a Christian and as a mentor to other people, you know what my number one thing I want to encourage people is this: hey, just love God. Love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. Get in His Word. Let me tell you something. I found out that if you work on the inside, God will that'll work its way to the outside. But when God identifies something as number two, we ought to pay close attention to that as well. Number one, we ought to love God with everything we have. But number two, we ought to love our neighbor as ourselves. Can I say this, friend? It's real simple. Treat other people like you would want to be treated. Listen, Jesus was quoting here when he said that in Matthew chapter 22. He was quoting Leviticus in chapter 19, verse 18 and verse 34, because it's quoted twice in there. In verse 18, it talks about their Hebrew neighbors, people like them, people who believe like them, people who look like them, people of the same ethnicity and religion and all that. But in verse 34, God goes on and says, hey, your neighbor is not just your neighbor, somebody that looks like you, that is like you, believes like you, but it's somebody else as well. It talks about strangers, people born in another country, different ethnicity, different race, different background. And God says you need to love them as well. So 2 times. Now listen, so twice in the Old Testament it says you should love your neighbor as yourself, people that are like you and people that are not like you. Now, over in the New Testament, this is really interesting. If God says something one time, it's important. If He repeats it a second time, we understand it's really important, it's significant. But when God says something 7 times, or repeats something 7 times, or writes it down 7 times, can I say it's completely and perfectly and absolutely important? And is a student of the Scriptures, you'll find that little phrase, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, not once, not twice, not 3, not 5 times, but 7 times in the New Testament. God reiterates, He puts it down in writing, that we ought to love our neighbor as ourselves. So what does that mean? What does that actually mean to me? Let's break this down. Number one, it means I need to love my neighbor. That means those that are like us and those that aren't like us. I need to respect my neighbor. That means those who agree with me and those who don't agree with me. The Bible goes on to say, and Jesus goes on to say about blessing people and praying for them. God says that those that are our neighbors, those that are, hey, you know, our neighbor is everybody on this terrestrial ball, everyone of the family of humankind. We need to bless our neighbors, those that are good to us and those who aren't. Jesus even gets further. He says we need to pray for our neighbors, those who love us and those who even hate us. And then He says we ought to do good to our neighbors, those who deserve it and those who don't deserve it. My friends, you and I, we live in a day right now where we've seen the uprising, again, a flare-up of this racial tension in our country, travesty, inequality, things that have been done that ought not to have been done. Now, I'm not going to be the judge. God will be the judge, and other people will sort these matters out legally. But I do believe, my friends, I'm calling each one of us individually, myself, my wife, my family, my church, my friends, those that are in our under watching this video. Listen, we need to return to a place or get to a place or come to a place of loving our neighbor, respecting our neighbor, blessing our neighbor, praying for our neighbor, and doing good to our neighbors. My friend, that would be a spiritual healing of a first-rate magnitude in our country. My friends, we need to pray for our country. We need to actively work to bless and help our country. My friends, I hope this has been a blessing and a help to you. And until we meet again, let's keep looking unto Jesus.